There are names that enlighten and names that wound. Some names uplift, while others bury entire peoples beneath shadows not their own. Among these names is one of the most infamous ever attached to a continent, the Dark Continent. In the 19th century, as Europe stretched its empires across the globe, this phrase became synonymous with Africa. It was written in books, spoken in lecture halls, repeated in newspapers, and spread through missionary reports. It shaped the way millions in the West viewed Africa, not as a land of history, culture, and light, but as a land of mystery, danger, savagery, and darkness. But Africa was never truly dark. The darkness lay not in the continent itself, but in the ignorance, arrogance, and greed of those who used the label. To understand the story of this name, we must step back into history, to the civilizations that thrived long before colonizers came, to the first European encounters with Africa, to the slave trade that scarred millions, and finally to the age of conquest, when the labeled Dark Continent became a powerful tool of propaganda. Long before the arrival of European explorers, Africa was not a blank space on the world's map. It was the cradle of humanity and the home of civilizations that rivaled, and in some cases surpassed, those of Europe and Asia. In the north, Egypt flourished for thousands of years. Its pyramids, temples, and hieroglyphs remain among the greatest wonders of the world. But Egypt was more than monuments. It was a land of science, mathematics, medicine, and literature. Ancient Egyptians studied the stars, developed calendars, built irrigation systems, and wrote medical texts. They influenced Greece and Rome, and through them, much of Western civilization. Further west, in what is today Tunisia, the city of Carthage rose as a maritime power. Founded by Phoenician traders, Carthage grew into a mighty empire that dominated the Western Mediterranean. Its navy was feared, its trade routes extended across Africa and into Europe, and its generals, especially Hannibal, became legendary. Carthage's conflict with Rome, known as the Punic Wars, shaped the ancient world. In West Africa, great empires flourished along the trade routes of the Sahara. The Ghana Empire rose first, controlling the trade in gold and salt. Later came the Mali Empire, under leaders like Sundiata, Keita, and Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 stunned the Islamic world with his wealth and generosity. He brought scholars and architects back to Mali, and Timbuktu became a center of learning. Its libraries filled with manuscripts covering law, science, philosophy, and poetry. After Mali, the Songhai Empire took power, building one of the largest states in African history, with cities like Gao and Timbuktu as centers of trade and culture. In Central Africa, the Kingdom of Congo flourished with a structured political system, intricate art, and international trade. In Southern Africa, the builders of Great Zimbabwe constructed massive stone walls and towers without mortar, showcasing advanced engineering and a thriving society linked to trade routes that reached the Indian Ocean. On the east coast, the Swahili city-states, Kilwa, Mombasa, Zanzibar, and others, became hubs of trade, linking Africa to Arabia, India, Persia, and China. They exported ivory, gold, and spices, and imported silks, ceramics, and books. These were cosmopolitan cities with their own unique blend of African, Arab, and Persian cultures. In the highlands, the Kingdom of Ethiopia stood as one of the world's oldest continuous Christian nations. Its rulers traced their lineage back to the union of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Ethiopia maintained independence through centuries, resisting invasions. and later famously defeating Italian forces at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, a moment that inspired anti-colonial movements across Africa and the world. This was Africa before the shadows, a continent full of light, history, and progress. Far from being dark, Africa was vibrant, connected, and innovative. When Europeans first encountered Africa in the ancient and medieval worlds, they did not call it dark. Greeks and Romans respected Egypt and Carthage. Medieval Europeans knew of Mali's wealth. Stories of Mansa Musa reached them and became legends. Trade with Africa was not new. For centuries, goods flowed between Africa, Europe, and Asia. But in the 15th century, things began to change. As Portugal and Spain sought new sea routes to Asia, they sailed down Africa's coasts. The Portuguese set up trading posts, first in West Africa, then further south, and eventually around the Cape of Good Hope into the Indian Ocean. At first, trade was in goods, gold, ivory, spices. But soon, human beings became the most profitable export. The Atlantic slave trade began in the 15th century and expanded massively over the next 400 years. Millions of Africans were captured, sold, and shipped across the Atlantic to the Americas. Families were torn apart, societies destabilized, and entire regions depopulated. For Europeans, Africa was increasingly seen not as a continent of civilizations, but as a source of labor, as a place to be exploited. The narratives around Africa began to change. As the centuries moved forward, Europe's appetite for wealth and expansion grew, and Africa became central to one of the darkest chapters in human history: the transatlantic slave trade. It was not just a trade in human bodies, it was a theft of culture, a tearing away of generations, and a rewriting of identity. Ports like Elmina Castle in modern-day Ghana, Island in Senegal, and Ouidah in Benin became infamous departure points where men, women, and children were chained, branded, and packed into ships bound for the Americas. The slave trade transformed how Europeans viewed Africa. In order to justify the brutality of slavery, they began to spread the idea that Africans were uncivilized, that their cultures were primitive, and that their societies lacked the structures of Europe. These were lies, but they served a purpose. They allowed the traders, the plantation owners, and the governments that profited from slavery to quiet their consciences. If Africa was dark, then it could be portrayed as needing the so-called light of Europe. By the 18th and 19th centuries, this narrative hardened further. Explorers like Henry Morton Stanley and writers like Joseph Conrad popularized the idea of Africa as an unknown, mysterious, and dangerous land. In Conrad's famous novel, Heart of Darkness, Africa was painted as a backdrop of savagery and horror, a land that corrupted men and swallowed them whole. To European readers who had never seen Africa, this imagery was powerful. It reinforced the idea that Africa was not a place of kingdoms, scholars, and trade, but a place of wildness and danger. This is when the phrase, "the dark continent," took hold. It was used by explorers, missionaries, and politicians. On the surface, it meant unexplored. Dark because Europe had not yet mapped it. Dark because Europeans claimed they did not understand it. But beneath that surface, it carried another meaning. Dark as in savage, dark as in uncivilized, dark as in lesser. And so, Africa's image was reshaped, not by its own people, but by outsiders. The same Europe that had benefited from Africa's gold, salt, ivory, and enslaved labor now spoke of it as a land without history. A German philosopher, Hegel, once declared that Africa was no historical part of the world. as if the civilizations of Mali, Ghana, Egypt, and Ethiopia had never existed. This arrogance was not innocent. It was preparation, because in the 19th century, Europe was preparing to conquer. The so-called scramble for Africa began in the late 1800s. Driven by industrialization, European powers sought raw materials, rubber, cotton, copper, gold, and new markets for their manufactured goods. They also sought prestige. To own colonies was to prove one's nation was powerful. In 1884 to 1885, European leaders gathered in Berlin at the infamous Berlin Conference. Not a single African leader was invited. In that room, the map of Africa was carved up with rulers and pens. Borders were drawn with no regard for the people living there, splitting ethnic groups apart, forcing rivals into the same territories, and laying the foundations for conflicts that would erupt generations later. To justify this conquest, Europe leaned heavily on the narrative of Africa as the Dark Continent. Colonizers claimed they were bringing civilization, Christianity, and progress. Missionaries carried the Bible. Soldiers carried guns. Railways, schools, and administrative systems were built, but always for the benefit of the colonizers, not the colonized. Wealth flowed out of Africa: rubber from the Congo, diamonds from South Africa, cocoa from Ghana, groundnuts from Senegal, while the people of Africa were subjected to forced labor, heavy taxation, and violence. The story of the Congo under King Leopold II of Belgium is perhaps the most horrifying example. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, millions of Congolese were forced to harvest rubber under brutal conditions. Those who failed to meet quotas were mutilated. Entire villages were massacred. Historians estimate that up to 10 million people died during Leopold's reign of terror. All the while, European newspapers praised the civilizing mission. In Africa, the mask of the Dark Continent hid the real darkness, the cruelty of exploitation. And yet, even in these times of great suffering, Africa's spirit endured. Resistance rose across the continent. The Zulu kingdom under Shaka and later leaders challenged European incursions in southern Africa. The Ashanti fought bravely against the British in West Africa. The Ethiopians, under Emperor Menelik II, defeated Italy at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, shocking Europe and proving that Africans could resist and win. This victory inspired not only Africans, but oppressed peoples around the world. As the 20th century dawned, the cracks in colonial domination began to show. Educated Africans, many of whom studied in Europe and America, began to question why the values of freedom and democracy preached in the West were denied to them at home. Figures like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, Patrice Lumumba of Congo, Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, and Nelson Mandela of South Africa rose to lead independence movements. They wrote, they organized, they marched, and when necessary, they fought. By the 1950s and 1960s, one by one, African nations began to reclaim their sovereignty. Ghana was the first sub-Saharan African nation to achieve independence in 1957 under Nkrumah's leadership. The wave spread quickly, and within a few decades, most of the continent was free of direct colonial rule. But freedom did not erase the damage. The borders drawn in Berlin left deep scars. Economies were still tied to exporting raw materials to former colonial powers. Ethnic tensions, often manipulated during colonial rule, flared into conflicts. And the label Dark Continent lingered in the Western imagination, even as African writers, artists, and leaders worked tirelessly to change the narrative. Chinua Achebe, the Nigerian novelist, famously challenged Joseph Conrad's portrayal of Africa. In Things Fall Apart, Achebe told the story of Igbo society from the inside, showing its complexity, its struggles, and its humanity. He insisted that Africa had its own voice, its own light. Other intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois, Leopold Senghor, and Ngujwa Thiongo contributed to dismantling the stereotypes and reclaiming Africa's story. Today, the phrase dark continent has been rejected by historians, scholars, and Africans themselves. It is recognized as a product of colonial prejudice, not truth. Modern Africa is a continent of over 1.4 billion people, more than 50 nations, thousands of languages, and countless cultures. It is a continent of rapid growth, of booming cities like Lagos, Nairobi, Johannesburg, and Cairo, of innovation in technology, art, and music. It is a continent that continues to face challenges, poverty, inequality, conflict, but also one that is bursting with potential, creativity, and resilience. Africa was never dark. What was dark were the lies told about it, the exploitation inflicted upon it, and the blindness of those who refused to see its brilliance. And so, when we look back at history, the phrase, the dark continent, becomes not a description of Africa, but a reflection of the ignorance of those who used it. The real history of Africa is one of light, a light that has endured through empires, through slavery, through colonization, and through liberation. It is a light that continues to shine, a reminder that no amount of false labels can erase the truth of a people's greatness. When we look deeper into the history of Africa before the colonial encounter, we find evidence that contradicts every stereotype that painted the land as backward or empty. Take the Kingdom of Mali. At its height in the 14th century, it was one of the wealthiest and most powerful empires in the world. Its capital city, Timbuktu, was not just a trading hub, but a center of learning. The University of Sankara housed tens of thousands of manuscripts on subjects, ranging from mathematics and astronomy to law and medicine. Scholars from across Africa and the Islamic world traveled there to study, proving that Africa was not a silent continent, but a place where knowledge thrived. Consider Mansa Musa, perhaps the most famous ruler of Mali. In 1324, he embarked on a pilgrimage to Mecca, traveling with a caravan so vast it stunned the world. He brought thousands of attendants, soldiers, and slaves, and carried so much gold that the economies of the regions he passed through, Egypt, Arabia, even beyond, were shaken by inflation. This single journey etched his name into global history and became a symbol of African wealth and influence. Mansa Musa's reign was marked not only by riches, but also by a commitment to education and culture. He commissioned mosques, libraries, and institutions that enriched Mali's intellectual heritage. In the east, the Swahili coast stood as another testament to Africa's global connections. Cities like Kilwa and Zanzibar prospered through trade across the Indian Ocean. African merchants exchanged ivory, gold, and slaves for Chinese silks, Persian ceramics, and Indian spices. Swahili itself is a language born of interaction, blending Bantu grammar with words from Arabic, Persian, and even Portuguese. Archaeological discoveries of Chinese porcelain in East Africa show how connected this region was to the wider world long before Europeans arrived. Further south, the builders of Great Zimbabwe created a city that astonished early visitors. Its stone walls, some stretching more than 5 meters high and assembled without mortar, enclosed a thriving settlement of thousands of people. Great Zimbabwe controlled trade routes that linked the African interior with the Indian Ocean coast. Gold from its mines reached as far as Arabia and India. This was not a land without history. This was a land where societies flourished, where engineering and trade were sophisticated, where people lived with dignity and complexity. Yet when Europeans first began to write their own narratives about Africa, they downplayed or ignored these realities. By the time of the so-called Age of Exploration, Africa was increasingly cast as a place of mystery. The Portuguese, the first to sail around its coasts in the 15th century, were less interested in documenting civilizations than in securing profits. Trading forts became centers of commerce, especially in human lives. Elmina Castle, built in 1482 on the coast of modern-day Ghana, became one of the first major European structures in sub-Saharan Africa. But its purpose was not cultural exchange or diplomacy. It became one of the largest slave trading depots, a place where countless Africans were held in dungeons before being shipped across the Atlantic. The slave trade grew into one of the largest forced migrations in history. Historians estimate that between the 16th and 19th centuries, over 12 million Africans were transported to the Americas. Millions more died during raids, marches to the coast, and the horrific Middle Passage across the Atlantic. On the plantations of the Caribbean, Brazil, and the American South, African labor built vast fortunes for European powers. Sugar, cotton, and tobacco made empires wealthy, while Africa was drained of its people. To justify this brutality, Europeans crafted an ideology of racial superiority. They claimed Africans were naturally suited for labor, that their cultures were primitive, and that they lacked the capacity for civilization. These lies became entrenched in literature, science, and politics. Pseudo-scientific theories of race emerged, placing Africans at the bottom of a fabricated hierarchy. This was the seedbed from which the labeled Dark Continent would grow. By the 19th century, with the abolition of the slave trade spreading across Europe and the Americas, attention shifted. The slave trade was ending, but European powers still hungered for Africa's riches. Explorers like David Livingstone, Richard Burton, and Henry Morton Stanley became household names in Europe. They wrote books that thrilled audiences with tales of vast rivers, exotic animals, and unknown peoples. Livingstone, a missionary explorer, spoke of bringing Christianity, commerce, and civilization to Africa. Stanley, funded by King Leopold II of Belgium, mapped the Congo and paved the way for its exploitation. Their writings often emphasized the mystery of Africa: dark forests, dangerous rivers, and hidden tribes. This reinforced the image of Africa as the Dark Continent. The irony was cruel. Africa was not unknown to Africans. Its rivers, mountains, and forests had been navigated for centuries. Its societies had their own systems of knowledge and order. But to European audiences, these explorers became the authorities, and their words carried weight. In 1884, the Berlin Conference marked the most decisive moment in Africa's modern history. Convened by Otto von Bismarck, the conference brought together representatives from Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, Portugal, Italy, and Spain. Their goal was to avoid conflict among themselves by dividing Africa into colonies. No African leaders were present. In that room, maps were spread on tables, and lines were drawn across lands the delegates had never seen. With strokes of pens, whole nations were dismembered. Borders were created that forced rival groups together, cut across cultural ties, and ignored existing political systems. The consequences were catastrophic. colonial rulers imposed their will through violence and manipulation. In French West Africa, the policy of assimilation forced Africans to abandon their languages and traditions in favor of French culture. In British colonies, indirect rule empowered local chiefs to enforce colonial policies, creating divisions and resentment. In the Congo Free State, King Leopold's private colony, the extraction of rubber was carried out with unimaginable cruelty. Villagers were forced to meet impossible quotas. Failure meant punishment. Hands cut off, families held hostage, entire communities destroyed. Reports of these atrocities eventually reached Europe, sparking outrage. But by then, millions were dead. The phrase "dark continent" became the mask for this violence. It allowed colonizers to claim they were bringing light to a place of darkness, even as they unleashed exploitation on a scale Africa had never known. Yet the true darkness was not Africa's. It was the greed and brutality of those who came in the name of progress. Still, Africa resisted. In West Africa, Samori led his people in a long struggle against French colonization. In southern Africa, the Zulu kingdom under Cetshwayo defeated British forces at the Battle of Asandawana in 1879, one of the most shocking defeats of a European army by an African force. In Sudan, the modest revolt challenged Anglo-Egyptian control, establishing a state that lasted for years. These were not passive victims. These were societies fighting for survival and dignity. By the mid-20th century, the winds of change began to blow. World War II weakened European empires, both economically and morally. African soldiers had fought alongside Europeans in the war, and they returned home with new expectations. The rise of Pan-Africanism, championed by leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey, inspired Africans to see themselves as part of a global movement for liberation. Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana declared that Africa must unite, and his words ignited hope across the continent. In 1957, Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African nation to gain independence. Nkrumah stood before the world and declared, "The independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of Africa." His words rang out like a prophecy. Within 2 decades, almost every African nation had broken free from colonial rule. The road, however, was not easy. Many new states faced economic dependence, political instability, and Cold War interference. In Congo, Patrice Lumumba, the charismatic first prime minister, was assassinated with the involvement of foreign powers, plunging the country into decades of turmoil. In Nigeria, ethnic tensions fueled a brutal civil war. In South Africa, apartheid continued until the 1990s, when Nelson Mandela's long imprisonment and eventual release symbolized both suffering and triumph. Mandela's life itself is a story that destroys the myth of the Dark Continent. He endured 27 years in prison, much of it on Robben Island, cut off from his family and people. Yet he emerged not with vengeance, but with reconciliation. When apartheid finally ended, he became South Africa's first black president, guiding the nation toward democracy. His resilience, his vision, and his leadership shone as a light to the entire world. He proved that Africa's greatest strength lay not in resources or armies, but in the courage and dignity of its people. Today, Africa is rewriting its own story. It is no longer content to be seen through the lens of colonial stereotypes. Lagos is a hub of technology and finance, with a booming film industry known as Nollywood. Nairobi is home to a growing tech ecosystem, dubbed the Silicon Savannah. Johannesburg thrives as a center of business and culture, Musicians from across the continent, Burna Boy, Angelique Kidjo, Wizkid, and many more, are shaping global sounds. Writers like Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie and Ingu Jwa Dianjo are commanding the world's attention with stories that center African voices. Challenges remain: poverty, inequality, climate change, and conflict. But these challenges do not define Africa. What defines Africa is resilience, creativity, and an unbroken thread of history stretching from ancient Egypt to modern innovation. The label dark continent was always a falsehood. Africa has always been a continent of light, its brightness dimmed only by those who refused to see it. The truth is this: Africa was never dark. It was made to appear dark in the eyes of those who exploited it. But the people of Africa have always carried their own light, and today that light is shining brighter than ever before. When the Berlin Conference ended in 1885, the map of Africa had been transformed, at least on paper. Vast territories had been claimed by European powers that had little understanding of the people, cultures, or landscapes within them. The British took control of Egypt and much of East and Southern Africa, stretching their empire from Cairo to Cape Town in what they dreamed would be a continuous red line on the map. The French carved out an enormous expanse of West Africa, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean deep into the Sahel. Belgium, through King Leopold II, claimed the Congo, a territory 70 times larger than his own country. Germany, a latecomer to empire, seized lands in today's Tanzania, Namibia, and Cameroon. Portugal clung to Angola and Mozambique, while Italy grasped at Eritrea, Somalia, and eventually sought Ethiopia. Spain, though weaker, held small territories in the northwest and along the Atlantic coast. On the ground, these colonial claims brought chaos. Borders cut across ethnic and linguistic groups, creating nations where multiple rival communities were forced to share power, or where one was elevated above the others to serve colonial interests. In Nigeria, the British united Hausa Fulani in the north, Yoruba in the west, and Igbo in the east into one colony, despite their vastly different systems of governance. In Rwanda and Burundi, Belgian authorities deepened ethnic divisions between Hutu and Tutsi, sowing seeds of future conflict. These artificial borders would haunt Africa for generations, yet resistance was never absent. In West Africa, Samori of the Wasulu Empire fought the French for over 2 decades, using guerrilla tactics and modern weaponry he acquired through trade. In present-day Sudan, the modest uprising defeated Egyptian and British forces, establishing an independent Islamic state that lasted until 1898. In East Africa, the Maji-Maji Rebellion of 1905 to 1907 saw diverse groups unite against German colonial rule, driven by both spiritual belief and political determination. Though it was brutally suppressed, it revealed a spirit of defiance that colonial powers could never fully extinguish. Perhaps the most famous victory was in Ethiopia, when Italy sought to expand its colonial holdings in the late 19th century. It confronted Emperor Menelik II. At the Battle of Adwa in 1896, Ethiopian forces, armed with modern weapons and united under a common cause, dealt the Italians a crushing defeat. It was one of the rare times an African army decisively defeated a European power during the colonial era. This victory preserved Ethiopia's independence and became a beacon of hope for oppressed peoples across the continent and beyond. But for much of Africa, colonization meant decades of exploitation. Railways were built not to connect Africans, but to transport raw materials to the coast for export. Schools taught colonial languages and histories while erasing African traditions. Laws privileged Europeans and relegated Africans to second-class status in their own lands. The wealth of the continent, its minerals, crops, and labor, flowed outward, while poverty deepened at home. The exploitation reached its most brutal expression in the Congo Free State. King Leopold II presented himself as a philanthropist, claiming he wanted to end the slave trade and bring civilization. In reality, he ruled the Congo as his personal possession, extracting rubber through a regime of terror. Villagers were forced into labor, held hostage, and mutilated if they failed to meet quotas. Reports of severed hands shocked the world when whistleblowers like Edie Morel and Roger Casement exposed the atrocities. International pressure eventually forced Leopold to cede the territory to the Belgian state in 1908. But by then, millions had died. As the 20th century progressed, Africa became a battleground in larger global struggles. During World War I, African soldiers fought in European armies, dying in trenches far from home. During World War II, even more were conscripted, fighting in North Africa, Asia, and Europe. When they returned, they asked themselves, why should they risk their lives for freedom abroad, only to live without freedom at home? This question fueled the rise of independence movements. Across the continent, leaders emerged who combined political vision with grassroots mobilization. In Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah organized strikes, protests, and campaigns that challenged British authority. In Kenya, the Momo Rebellion used armed struggle to confront colonial settlers. In Algeria, a bloody war of independence raged against France, costing hundreds of thousands of lives, but eventually securing freedom. In Congo, Patrice Lumumba rose as a charismatic leader, demanding genuine independence. His vision of unity and self-determination was seen as a threat during the Cold War. And within months of independence in 1960, he was assassinated with the involvement of foreign powers. His death symbolized both the promise and the peril of post-colonial Africa. South Africa's struggle took longer. Under apartheid, a system of racial segregation and oppression, Black South Africans were denied basic rights and confined to homelands. Resistance grew through movements like the African National Congress, strikes, and international boycotts. Nelson Mandela, imprisoned for 27 years, became the face of this struggle. When apartheid finally ended in 1994 and Mandela was elected president, it marked one of the most significant victories for human dignity in modern history. But independence did not erase the difficulties. Many nations inherited economies designed to serve colonial powers rather than their own people. Infrastructure was geared toward export, not domestic needs. Education systems were limited, health services underdeveloped. Political systems were fragile, and Cold War rivalries often turned African nations into proxies for global powers. Coups, dictatorships, and civil wars erupted, leaving scars that remain today. Yet even in these struggles, Africa's resilience shone. Writers like Chinua Achebe, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and Wole Soyinka gave voice to African perspectives, challenging stereotypes and reclaiming history. Musicians like Fela Kuti in Nigeria and Miriam Makeba in South Africa used art as resistance, their songs carrying messages of freedom across borders. Intellectuals like Julius Nyerere of Tanzania championed African socialism, seeking to build societies rooted in communal traditions rather than imported models. The formation of the Organization of African Unity in 1963, later transformed into the African Union, marked an attempt to foster continental solidarity. Though imperfect, it signaled Africa's determination to speak with one voice on the global stage. Pan-Africanism, the belief that the continent's destiny lay in unity, continued to inspire leaders and ordinary citizens alike. In the 21st century, Africa faces a new chapter. It is home to the youngest population in the world, with over 60% under the age of 25. Its cities are growing rapidly, becoming centers of culture, business, and innovation. Lagos is one of the world's fastest-growing megapolis. Nairobi has become a hub for technology, earning the nickname Silicon Savannah. Kigali, once scarred by genocide, has rebuilt into one of the cleanest and most organized cities on the continent. Africa's cultural influence is global. The rhythms of Afrobeats, the creativity of Nollywood, the literature of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and the art of El Anatsui are shaping global culture. African entrepreneurs are creating solutions for their own challenges. Mobile banking in Kenya, solar energy projects across the Sahel, and digital startups from Cape Town to Cairo. Still, challenges persist. Poverty, inequality, climate change, and political instability. But these challenges are not signs of darkness. They are the same struggles faced by every part of the world in different forms. What makes Africa unique is the determination of its people to rise above them. And so, when we hear the phrase, the dark continent, we must remember its true meaning. It was never about Africa itself. It was about the ignorance of those who could not, or would not, see its light. The pyramids of Egypt, the libraries of Timbuktu, the stones of Great Zimbabwe, the courage of Adwa, the resilience of Mandela. These are Africa's true story. A story not of darkness, but of brilliance. The light of Africa has always been there. It was hidden, distorted, and denied, but never extinguished. Today, that light is shining once again, not only for Africa, but for the world.